I'm Mark Weber of the Computer History Museum. I'm here on August 1st, 2024, with Scott Densmore, Vice President of Engineering at GitHub and an expert on the use of generative AI in programming. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
So could you state your own name, and then in just a couple of sentences explain to a general public visitor your background and what led to your interest in AI assistance for coding?
So my name is Scott Densmore. I've been in developer tools most of my life, anywhere between the IDE or in some kind of cloud-based development. And over the years, I have found that we've made incremental improvements on developer productivity and in what we can do in coding. And I found that AI was the kind of next revolution we could make and to take in doing and helping developers be more productive with their coding.
So, first question. My son is going to coding camp next week. He's 10. Is there any need for him to learn coding, or is this like, I don't know, learning assembly language after high level languages were invented? I mean, will there be any need for coding as we know it today in the future?
Will there need to be any coding, known coding in the future, kind of know how things work? I don't think code is the real thing to focus on here. Code is a means to an end. I always say, like, we solve problems with code, but I think the main piece that to focus on for anyone learning to do coding is problem solving skills, analytics. Like, how do I solve this problem? Once you're able to do that, coding is just, again, a means to an end. So I can write the code so that the computer can interpret these things. So in your example of assembly language and these higher level languages, I think when you think about these large language models and generative AI, that higher level language that we've always been trying to reach, especially in development, is natural language. What is my natural language that I can learn? And usually when you can solve a problem, you're doing it in your natural language. You're just trying to take that and turning it into code.
Good answer. So can you briefly explain how chatbots are currently being used in coding and how programmers are integrating them into their work?
So today we use chatbots and chat in general in coding to, just like we would talking to maybe we turn a term called pair programmer. This is someone who sits next to you, or if you've used the term rubber ducking, where you're just, you pick up a rubber duck and you talk to it and try to explain the problem to them, and you try and say, how would I solve this problem? That's what they're doing today, is like, I know the problem, I know what I'm trying to do, but I may not know how to write the code to actually do it. How could I do that? Like, how do I do that in Python, or how do I do that in Go or Rust or C# or C++? How do I solve this problem in a specific way or coding? So if I need to write some algorithm that does merge sort, I can do that and say, like, how do I do that in C++? And that's a pretty known way to do that. And I can get that out of the chatbot. And the other key there is it's an interactive thing. So it has context of, I can refine that conversation over and over with that pair programmer of saying, providing more context. Like, you and I are having a conversation here, but if you don't have all the context, you may answer a question in one way, like you asked me, versus another. But if I can provide more context, I can get closer and closer to an answer that's like, oh yeah, this is how I would do this.
Excellent. And can you talk about the history of coding AI assistants? And CoPilot's now what, 3 years old? But I mean, where did it come from? Were there prior ones prior to deep learning, like rules-based or Bayesian, or what's the history there?
Yeah, I mean, like, we could probably talk many years about the history of if you really think about, we've been in the developer community trying to always raise the level of abstraction. Like, how do we make it easier? How do you make programming more approachable for more individuals? And if you think about 3 years ago when we were thinking about, like, these LLMs, what could you do with tokens. So these things are just token generators. Like, how can I put tokens into it? How can I get tokens back? Well, programming is pretty token based and easy, like has a pretty structured format when you talk about these languages. How can we actually get it to work with these? So when we first started Copilot, we started with something called code completion, where it can kind of predict what you're going to type next based on context around what you're already programming. So if I'm in the middle of a file and I'm typing up a function that does, we'll pick on merge sort again. If I'm doing merge sort, hey, I can say, all right, I stop typing merge. Well, this LLM is been trained enough on coding to say, oh, you probably mean merge sort. Let me go ahead and give you that. I know the language you're in, so I can actually give that to you. So that was like this first piece to say, like, hey, we can make people more productive because we can codify and or train these models to understand language and coding, and then we can use that to help make the developer more productive. So you don't have to write all this boilerplate code that you've normally done, and you can focus again on the solving the problem that you're trying to solve. And over time, one of the things that when Copilot was being built during this time frame, it was pretty amazing. As when things happened, it was kind of spooky, like, oh, it actually knew what I was saying. It's like, this is like magic. Or if it got it completely wrong, known as hallucinations, I call that kooky. Like, this is kind of kooky. Why are you telling me that this is what this is? But that is what led us to, this idea that we could bring in, these tokens, but using it in a very good way to say, here's a practical product use of these large language models, and coding is a great use of that because it's kind of, we know it's a known of the tokens that we need, and can be, we have a large swath of programming languages that we can train these models on.
So, I assume the idea came out of autocomplete for natural language processing for human language.
Correct. Yes.
But it actually deployed before large language models hit the mass public.
Right. So if you think about autocomplete, I even think about it when I was development in the early days of my career, that I had a text editor and a compiler. I really had no help other than books at my desk on how to do development. So when I joined Microsoft, even way back when in the late 90s and early 2000s, and working developer tools, it started to come along, like, even before I started here, it was like, oh, I can like write these functions, and it knows enough to bring up like this autocomplete of knowing what I might, here's the available options that you could type. And if you think about that, that's just kind of like, and we kind of build on this, we're getting better, smarter and smarter about knowing all the things around you in the files and things. If you could just have something that was trained enough to even know not only like what are my available options, but what am I actually trying to do based on the context around me. No difference than if you and I are having a conversation and I'm trying to write some code and I explain it to you, you could say like, well, you could write this kind of code to solve that problem. But yeah, it's like the evolution of that.
And what are GitHub CoPilot's main competitors or other tools in the space?
Yeah, I think the main one is ChatGPT, right? GitHub CoPilot was around before ChatGPT, but until ChatGPT, this whole generative AI chatbot thing was still kind of a nascent thing on the edge. People didn't really know about it, but it became this huge thing. So a lot of people still use ChatGPT. That's one of our big competitors. There's Codium, Tab9, a few others that are Google, AWS, Whisper. I think that's what they call it, Q or Whisper. I think that's what they used to call it. And then Google Gemini as well have gotten into this arena. But it's a good thing. I love competition because it makes us all better. And I think it's a really good thing to drive, have that competition to drive this forward for making, like I said, it's making developers more productive and happy.
But for the other, to use a general large language model, it's not customized for programming the way
right. Well, correct. Like we do a lot of work on the prompting and model side to do it for customization of coding. And as these models are getting smarter and better and better and cheaper, that's what more and more people do. And this is where you see the competition from, because we have access to all the same models now, which is great. GitHub CoPilot is doing, specific things for it to be very, we're following this one specific path, which is all about development and programming to make that a better paradigm. And we want to democratize that as well on the side of bringing natural language into the picture so that we can help, solving your problems becomes explaining to your problems, typing in your natural language to get the code you need to solve that problem.
And so what is the working relationship between most programmers and the assistant? Are they using it more for coming up with sort of frameworks or concepts for pair programming, which you already mentioned, in real time, for reviewing code afterwards, all of these, something else?
All of the above. If you really think about where GitHub CoPilot is going and what we view as the kind of next wave of how we help developers be more productive, our focus is let the developers, and again, it's called CoPilot because we still think the human is the pilot of this. Let them focus on the things that they're good at, which is the creativity, which is why a lot of us got into programming in the first place, because it's like that cross-section of science and art. Like, I love the creativity part, and then I need to know the science to actually build the thing I'm working on. And we want to put that, that AI features, like, special features of CoPilot across the entire software development lifecycle. Whether I'm going from all the way from idea to deploying that in production or running my own hobby project or whatever I'm doing, that should be with me all the way, either so that I can describe the problem that I'm doing and I can generate the code. I can have a build system that builds, but if my build breaks, how can I ask CoPilot to help me understand why it broke? All the way through, can CoPilot help me do code reviews? So if I'm, to go, like, here's some simple things that you could do to make this code better based on some rules that you have that I've seen been around other code that you have, or even come up with fixes for vulnerabilities and securing the software supply chain. So injecting all of this into the actual software development lifecycle is what we're doing with CoPilot, because in the end, developers spend 25% of their time coding and the rest of the time doing everything else: code reviews, PRs, builds, support, all of these other things. So if we can, inject that into the entire software development lifecycle, we free up that time to do what they want to do, which is be more creative and so that makes them feel more productive.
But visual artists, at least, feel that sometimes the creativity is being taken away by the chatbot.
Right. Yeah.
The generative AI is so creative that they leave them to do scut work.
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing there is, I'm not an artist. I can barely draw stick figures, but I definitely believe that it's a great way to think about prototyping and how you can get your creative ideas out first and then refine them, right? I think especially from programming, and I'm not an artist by trade, so
but I'm making the comparison. Sorry,
yeah,
I'm saying,
but in terms of like,
is that fear realistic for programmers as well? That
I believe that there is
a creative, fun part could be taken by the AI, leaving them to do less creative.
I think in some ways, I think that is, on an infinite timeline, I don't know where we'll be, but I believe that what I think that will always come down to is you want to solve a problem, right? Like we go back to the question you asked me about your son in coding camp and like, what should he focus on? That problem solving is what I see as the creativity. And if we can get even if it created the best code in the world, why would I care if I'm solving the problem? There's no understanding of the problem yet. Like I don't know where this goes, but even if it understood the system, it would know. I always say, like, understanding the system is like next level Star Trek thing, where I can just say, hey, hey, CoPilot, I need you to do X, Y, and Z, and it knows all the places. Well, we're not there today, but you can imagine is I still need to know what the problem is. I still need to know how to solve that. If you think about, my Star Trek reference, for those that know Star Trek, it is the same thing. On the bridge, I'm still trying to solve the problem. I'm just not having to sit there and code the problem out. I just need to solve the problem. And that coding part becomes like less of the toil that I have to do. It's I solve problems. And the great thing about that, at least in my mind, if I look back in history, once we've automated a lot of things away, we open up from a human perspective the ability to do more. Those new more things, because we don't even know what we're not doing because we spend so much time on the toil. So let's open that up, get rid of the toil, and give us let the creative part go, well, what is the next thing we should be doing? And that other piece just becomes, something that's automated and gone away, just like that's why we all got into development, so we could automate things because we're lazy.
And how do most programmers feel about using Copilot or similar tools?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mix. I've seen and I've talked to customers and developers that love it. They said I would never. I don't know how I did my job without it. I had a staff engineer who she worked for me, and she came up to me and she's like, I don't know how I built software with Copilot, without Copilot before. And there's still a lot of people who are just very skeptical, and I think that's becoming less and less as Copilot has crossed the chasm into people use this as a tool now to help them be more productive, to kind of reduce that toil, to allow them to focus on that creativity part and solving the problems that, I don't have to set up all these things, or I don't have to write test cases. I can have a lot of the AI do that for me.
And can you provide examples of specific areas where Copilot's been particularly effective and others where it has not been?
Where it's been really, effective is especially in the code completion place, where it kind of knows you're predicting what you're going to type next and about what's around the context where you have around that. I think another good example is for the chat piece, where people are using it to kind of rubber duck, prototype, ask questions, kind of think about solving the problems there. And then the other one is generating test cases. A lot of times developers, we're really good at writing bugs, but and no one really wants to write the test cases. They were like, I don't want to do that. That's not the creativity part. So allowing to Copilot to build those test cases for you, to do, again, a lot of the toil work you don't want to do, that has been an amazing part where people are like, I can ask Copilot to test all these cases. And also in chat, I can start going like, right on my unit tests now, right? Like some of these negative tests, like what happens in this situation? What happens if this was the case? And all that coding gets done for them, which they could have done, but they know what they want to do. Is just like typing it out is like, I just don't really want to do that. That's not really enjoyment for me. So specifically, I've heard that was like, everybody was like, yes, sign me up. I'll do that all day. I'll take that one all day. I'd say that was the top three.
And how about areas where it's been disappointing the way it worked out?
I think the hype was a little bit more. I think people's expectations were a little high, right? And which it totally gets it. Like a lot of people, they saw ChatGPT, they saw these AI products, and they were like, it's going to solve everything for me. It doesn't understand the system yet. I think that's where it really comes down to. It's like we haven't reached that level of system understanding. So when you start typing, you're doing things, it's like, well, that's not how my system works. Well, it has this it doesn't have the innate ability to understand your entire system yet. It knows how to understand code bases. It understands, it can understand large sets of code bases. We even allow you to build your own custom models on your code. But when it comes to like the system and how it all puts together, it's not quite there yet. But I believe that we'll get there in terms of how you go. And system is because it's a construct that we created that you have to tell, like you have to define. And we have to come up with a way to define that system in a way that is understandable and trainable. And right now it's like when we built these, we're really good at building complicated systems. You have these complicated systems that exist, but how do you define them and how do you reason about them? We're just not there yet, I think we'll get there. It is something we actually think about a lot.
And by system, you mean the whole product?
The whole product, your application. Like imagine trying to, the this system that was built that we're talking over, this video system, like, how is all put together, all the different pieces? Would a Copilot understand how all of that? If you said, like, I want to add this one thing to the system, it'd be like, okay, I can add it to the code, but I don't know how it affects the entire system.
Got it. Yeah, and I mean, I saw in some of your more current announcements, you're trying to go beyond autocomplete to get into the
Yes,
whole life cycle of software in the organization. And
correct.
that's where you're talking about that it's hard without understanding in this global sense.
Right. And even then, it's like, if you saw some of the stuff we've done, we have this idea called, and we're really thinking this through, it's called Workspace. And this is kind of our idea behind what's next for like developers and how would you interact as a development tool. So today, developers running their IDE, they write their code, Copilot's with them, all this stuff. But what if you could start a different way? What if you could write, like, here's the thing I want to do. Like, I'm in my repo, I have some code, but you just write up what we call issues in GitHub. And you started with an issue and you said, like, I want to add a login page to my website, right? Like, I don't have one, I'm going to do that now. What if I could then just hit a button in my issue, open up an entire experience that said, here's the plan, spec for this. Like, it would write out what the specification was from your natural language version of, like, I want to create a login page. And then you say, like, yeah, that seems right. Or you can edit it. And then it would create a plan for you. And then you could edit that plan. Like, I'm going to write this file. I'm going to put it in this place. I'm going to, like, this is what I'm going to do, but in a very visual way. And then you're like, great, go generate it. And it went off and generated the code. And then right there, you could open up that you could edit that by doing, it's almost a REPL environment to say, all right, run that code, open up the website, show me the login page. I can share that with I can save the workspace. I can share it with my colleague. I could create a PR from that. I can, I can open up a terminal and operate in the terminal right there, but all from within one place to kind of edit that idea. And this is kind of our thinking of how can we change the workflow if you're doing it in a very natural language way. You can still operate with the code. It's very similar, like a diff operation on GitHub today. But what if I could just do that right within, start from an issue and go all the way through right on the website, right from there. I don't have to open up an editor and do anything. Like, this is kind of the next evolution of thinking around not just Copilot in terms of helping you do autocomplete and chat, but what can we do based on all the building blocks we have in GitHub to kind of build this new, experience using Copilot, and all of that stuff is still with you, but it's in this new experience.
And with that, I mean, one of my questions was, how does GitHub Copilot integrate with Microsoft's, other Copilots? And it seems like that would almost start to communicate with them.
When we think about GitHub Copilot and Microsoft's Copilots, they are separate, right? Like, they're not the same things. In fact, it was GitHub Copilot and it was such a good name, Microsoft adopted it. But I mean, if you think about all these Copilots, let's talk about it from a standpoint of, like, if I am a user of Microsoft Office and I'm using GitHub Copilot, these Copilots are really just things that I interact with in a natural language way. I shouldn't care if I'm in Teams asking my colleague about some code that's sitting on GitHub that in Teams it shouldn't know about that. So we have this extensibilities, as well as the Microsoft Copilots have this extensibility model that allows you to bring in these, most people call them agents, but bring in the Copilots together, and then what we're working on is, right now you have to kind of invoke this, and, like, it's a little bit awkward because you have to know that this Copilot's there. But, like, what if we could do this in a natural language way, and we confer, like, if I say the code on, the code in the repo, and there is an agent behind the scenes, like, oh, I know how to deal with repos, and I go out and get that for you. Like, what does it shouldn't matter. So if you think about that from a big Microsoft Copilot perspective, all of these things are just Copilots, and they should be with you everywhere you go, because they're Copilots. And they should infer when I'm talking about something, whether it be in Teams or a Word doc or on an issue inside of GitHub, that they work together to bring all that information together to bear. I always say this, I kind of relate it to this is, when you think about these things as humans, and if we focus on developers as that, we expect a lot of developers these days. They don't just write code anymore. We have this like massive expectation that they know observability tools, they know about your database, they know everything. They're supposed to be an expert in everything. The reality is that's probably not true, and really hard to do. So what if you bring the experts to everyone, to the developer? And that's where these copilots and other agents that plug into Copilot can help. So, for example, we have partners and we use these tools inside of GitHub, in fact, called Sentry and Datadog. There's observability tools. And we have been working with them to build plugins for GitHub Copilot. But if I'm a developer and something happens on the site at 2:30 in the morning on a Saturday, because that's when something always happens, and I get woke up, wouldn't it be great if I had all these experts with me that I could start asking questions in a very natural language, like, hey, Sentry, what's this error all about? And right in chat, right within .com, it knows about the repo. It knows about what's going on. It gives me the exception. I can then go over to the repo. I can open it up in a code space, which is just I open it up in VS Code, which is right inside my web. I can go to that exception because it knows about the context of the repo. And then I can highlight that exception and I can ask Copilot to just suggest a fix for me because, it knows about my code base. I can check that in. I can have a PR out. Copilot can review my PR. I can push that to production and I can be back in bed in 30 minutes, right? Like that's a big difference. And what that does is really lower the mean time to resolution for customers as well. And what that has done is brought those experts to the developer to help them be more productive.
And natural language can become like the glue language between all these different systems.
Correct.
Just ordinary human speed.
Correct. That is absolutely the case. It's like, just like me programming in natural language, I should be able to talk to all of these copilots and these agents in natural language.
And they can, to some, is there any internal way would they be incompatible systems can theoretically use natural language between them?
Correct.
Because I think we looked at some examples with Spot, the Boston Dynamics robot, where it connects to different systems using natural language. So, is that idea of sort of the ultimate glue language being our language?
Yes. So, that's the inference. Is like today you have to kind of tell the system, hey, I'm talking to this agent versus not talking to this agent. But if you can infer it, it just becomes natural language. And all these disparate systems can talk to each other.
And the main issues that Copilot's addressing now, so writing code, maintaining it, I assume, testing, integration into the organization, which goes back to what we were talking about. Are there any of those that you want to talk about that might not be obvious? Everyone knows writing code, but
right.
How about maintenance?
Well,
you mentioned testing.
Yeah, testing, and then it's just like code reviews and fixing vulnerabilities and suggesting fixes for those. There's the idea we talked about with Workspace, where we're trying to change how you actually go from idea to production and how you interact with the code in a certain way. But the ultimate goal is to bring natural language as the way to do development, and then we interop with the code that you already have. So because everybody has something different. But I think, long term, it would be code. This is the higher level language that we reach to. And that generates whatever the, the zeros and ones that the computer can understand at the end of the day, whatever language that gets compiled in or interpreted in. Then but it becomes that becomes the toil. Writing that actual code becomes the toil, just like it used to be when it was writing the code and compiling it, or writing it in assembly and compiling it. There's a lot of toil to actually do all that work. And so we built these higher and higher level languages. And I think this is just the place we're going to. And these large language models are helping us get there.
So one weakness in chatbots and other applications is sort of having a real memory of past interactions with a person. This is true
Right.
in education, it's true in therapy. Um, is that a problem with, for instance, the ideal AI pair programmer would know some problem that the person had worked through 10 years before and have,
Right.
but isn't this like what we did back then? But I mean, how does Copilot handle sort of having a past record, and is it good at that kind of interaction over time?
So I think as an engineering problem, it depends. I want to kind of address that, how you have context over time. So context is really we've talked about a little bit, this is really the key to this whole point of kind of everything. How do I have enough context to make a decision or give you an answer or give you a set of tokens that could possibly be the answer? And, chat in itself is a history of like, how can I inject all this context over and over and over again? And really these models, as they get bigger, are having this, when they talk about context windows, is like, how can I shove more tokens, which is really the history of things, into context? And when it comes to, there's different ways of doing that. But when it comes to coding, I think the context is the code. As I've always said, it's like, we can have documentation all over the place about how things work, but the real source of truth is the code itself. So if we can build like context enough around this code, we kind of can infer the history, right? Like in GitHub, we have history of all the code. We can infer these things. We kind of know how things are. You can ask like, what was the code like 10 commits ago, right? Like, and it understands these concepts, or will understand these concepts around that, so that you don't forget things. Now, in a conversation, like a recent conversation, you only have so much context. So even then, that's why we have to pick and choose around what context we're doing, depending on what you're doing, so we're not having to feed all of it in there. And then there's another, beyond the models, I think I mentioned this earlier, but we also allow you to train your own models. So in GitHub CoPilot, you can say, all right, take all this code and build a model out of that. Not only the models that you know about languages and programming, but here, build a model with my code so that it has weights and can have understanding about the code that I'm talking about. So it looks more personalized in my responses and things like that. And then also there's another technique called retrieval augmentation generation, or RAG, that allows you to index your code. And these indexes are, depending on how you do your chunking of this code, allows you to do retrieval so that you can do even better at retrieving context, knowing what context to use and at what time to put that in. So just like as your example of, we're really bad at remembering things as humans over time. As anyone could, as even I can tell you, because some things that happened 10 years ago seem like yesterday, and the same opposite. The idea is, if these models can help us do the memory, because it's trained on, up to a certain point. And we can also use the code as a source of truth and do indexing on that to help the memory of things.
I guess the fact that a repository like GitHub has all the changes tracked is an immediate source that is not available for other uses of generative AI.
Right. Like if you think about like Word, documents and text and things like that, it's really hard because you don't have a change log of how all that stuff, how did it become, how did the art of war become the art of war, right? How many revisions did it go through? We don't have that. All we have is the actual end result. Where in code and things like that, you kind of have the history of everything you started with, if it's been in source control. Like if we had a source control for a book, you would like have the history of the book.
Like Wikipedia has all those records for its own articles.
Right. Yeah. So like
applied to that, it seems.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's where the training of these models happens. So that goes on all this data so that we can at least come up with the tokens. And again, it's just like they're tokens, the weight of the tokens and what type of things are associated. Like, based on what tokens you gave me, I can predict what tokens should be next.
And are coding chatbots a job threat to programmers or a way to augment their reach?
I think it's chatbots are not a threat to programmers. I think it's a threat to the toil of programmers, which I think is a good thing. I come back to this all the time because, when we, the way I think about this is, it's this, if I think about my history lessons is, I akin this to like the Industrial Revolution when we went from horse and buggies and, candles to, the automotive, the industry, the automating everything is there were a lot of things that changed, a lot of jobs that went away, but we found new ways and innovative ways to use that time and energy to put into new things. So I think that, I always say is like, what are you going to do with all that extra time? Right? Like, what is it that you do? So you could do more creative things. You could do more, provide more value into the world that now, because you're not having to focus on the things that before may have felt like your job, but now like you're saying, that's not my job anymore. So what can I do now that's not my job anymore? And I kind of seem to, I'm a very positive person and optimistic of saying like, I think that's a good thing that we can move past a lot of the toil and then focus on that creativity. We can focus on the next set of things that we can come up with because, when we had more time, we came up with these large language models. So great, now we have them. What is the next thing we're going to do when we've automated or at least removed a lot of that toil as humans and developers to focus on the next thing?
But I mean, special knowledge of a particular programming language can be a big part of job security for some people.
Right.
Is this eroding that particular advantage, or conversely, it lets people that may not know, a language relevant to a job they're looking at adapt more quickly?
Yeah, I think so. I think, to the part of your first question of is it a threat to folks that are specialized in programming languages? I don't think so. I think there will always be a need, for the foreseeable future, there will be a need to know how the programming language work. I mean, at some point we have to train it to know how the thing is put together. Like if you come up with a brand new programming language, because I think they happen a lot, which is great to come up with a better way of doing things. How do you train that when there's no code or anything available? Like what's the model there? So I think there will always be a need for those things to know that. But I do think you're right in terms of like, it's more approachable in how I can do these things. I still think you'll, for the foreseeable future, need to know the syntax, those type of things, but it makes it more approachable from a standpoint of like a lot of code is written in C++ or C. A lot of people don't get taught C, or they don't understand pointers, or a lot of things in those programming languages that just aren't like super intuitive. So CoPilot and those type of tools can help you learn and grow and actually focus on, hey, I got this problem to solve. How would I do this in C? Because there's a lot of code in C out there that's been trained on, and C++ has been trained on. So how would I actually do this? And it can get you to that point where you're familiar with the syntax and the libraries around it and those things. And so, I've said like learning the language is part of the problem. Then there's learning all the libraries around it that are used by all the things that you're programming in. And then there's actually then using that to solve the problem. And if you can reduce that time frame to get to the solving of the problem, I think that's great.
So some people think the Y2K bug was actually a retirement plan by some of the COBOL programmers back in the 60s. Just a joke. Seems like some of them.
I can tell you what, I cannot tell you how many people still use COBOL today. I was like, it's one a retirement plan. It's still used today. And interesting, you say it's quite interesting is that a lot of companies and a lot of customers that I talk to are interested in like, how can generative AI help me move to a different language? There just isn't many people that know COBOL. And there's just like the same thing. Yeah, they all retired in Y2K. And there's just not that. I mean, I remember I wrote COBOL in college. And they want to go from, this is kind of like another thing that we've been you can use generative AI for. It's like, how do you migrate from COBOL to a Java or a C# or a JavaScript or something like that? There's a lot of nuance in there, but like, can you get the models trained on understanding how things work from a code to thing? But then it comes back to my question, is like, and can you get them to understand how the system works? But is there a way to use these models to help train that, like maybe a specific model on doing migrations from these COBOL systems to a more modern language?
Because that
Because
was really, I mean, that was my question, is sort of maintainability. Like if
right,
Y2K happened today, or let's say 5 years from now, when this stuff's even more mature, would there be a sort of co-pilot way to handle that might be quite different than calling people back out of retirement?
yeah, for sure, this is something that we have been looking into uh, for a little while, of how you do this migrations. You know, how would you first understand COBOL, which means you also understand the schema, because COBOL is usually based on a database schema. That's usually the kind of correlation there. And then how do you then turn that into some other language that matches that database schema, that and then validate it that it actually works from a standpoint of, for the customer. If I'm a bank and my whole entire business is built on top of this COBOL system, I can't, you know, I don't know if I want to invest years of work to actually get into a new language. But even if I do invest, we can have a model migrate it. How do I validate
Well,
this is right?
would you need to, or you could get your COBOL chatbot, in essence, could just
Correct.
fix a few things in COBOL, leave it in
Sure. Yeah, that's the other possibility, is you just train a model that's good enough on COBOL that you can do COBOL, right? This is the other piece, is like, maybe migration is not the right answer. Maybe what we need is, you can just have anyone maintain your COBOL program now. It's not about, you don't have to invest all that time and effort in doing that, because that's, again, a lot of toil and effort. How about I just figure out how to do COBOL and give the people the power to do COBOL in their natural language?
and maybe let the COBOL chunk talk to something written in a totally different, obscure language, and you never need
Right.
to.
One day, you never know what's going to happen a year from now in this space.
And so you, I'll ask you the, so about, I know you were talking about how you can train a model on, or train Copilot on your own data, your own corporate corpus. But that that's clearly for some companies very important for confidentiality and privacy. But I know there's been some issues with copyright and coding AI. Can you talk about, client privacy and copyright in this context?
Sure. I could tell you what we do in Copilot to help our customers, and what our view of that is. So we have a couple of things where, we're very confident in Copilot. We even offer indemnification. We did this as well. Microsoft even adopted this. So if you're using Copilot and you have the feature I'll talk about a little bit that turned on, we are sure that there's nothing copyrighted by that's produced by Copilot. In other words, nothing that matches. So what we do behind the scenes is, we actually look at and index all the open source code on GitHub, and we say, if anything matches that within 100 character, 150 characters ish, we will tell you and or not show you this code, so that we have no idea what a license is, but it looks similar to something else. So to keep you out of trouble and to keep any questions about that, we just don't give you that code. So we see that we index all this code, and based on that algorithm, we'll not show that. And and when we talk about training, we don't use customer data to train. Like, that was a big thing. This is like, anything you give us, any tokens and prompts you send us, we don't do anything to train Copilot with. The only training we do is on your personal data, and you only get access to it. So if you tell us, hey, train my code, use my code to train a model specific to me, we do that. We use also some of your prompts to help train that model, but it's all yours. And we are very protective of our customers' privacy, and ensuring that we only do things for them, and we don't use any data that we collect to train models that we have, so that everything is done. Especially like even code specific models that we work on is done training on the languages and the data that we have ourselves.
And how do you deal with hallucinations? That occasionally it'll suggest stuff that's just crazy.
The kooky part of this. So how do we deal with hallucinations? We spend an exorbitant amount of time on quality. So these are not, unlike programming itself, these LLMs are not deterministic. They're probabilistic, so there's token generators. But what we do a lot on that side is we spend a lot of time on quality, and we have an applied science team here that works specifically on the prompting and the tuning of the prompt. And when I talk about the prompt, this is like what we do as context to send along to the models to kind of tell it how to interpret the context we're giving it, and also a bunch of secret things that we do, and not so secret, about how we get it to respond. And
prompt engineering in one form.
Prompt engineering, basically. So we spend a exorbitant amount of time on that, and we have quality scorecards across multiple languages to tell us how things are changing or doing. So we spend a lot of time experimenting, if I want to call it that. We have a culture of experimentation where, anytime we change something, we have these offline evaluations, which basically offline just means we're not testing it in real production. And then we have a bunch of scorecards that tell us, is this change better or worse in terms of determining whether or not this change is helping the output and reducing the number of hallucinations possibly that come back from the context that we give it. And then we run online experimentations where we do some A/B testing to actually collect information about whether that's true or not as well before we ever roll things out. And we do that every time we upgrade a model. You would think models are getting better all the time, which they do, but your prompts may make the model work worse. So we always have to test that before we roll out any model changes as well. And that's how we spend, again, an exorbitant amount of time working on the quality of making sure that those hallucinations don't come back. Not to say that it doesn't, but we're very good at, like, most of the times, sending back the right languages, because you can imagine I don't want to be in a JavaScript file and a bunch of Python show up, and making sure that the code that comes back is workable, compilable, so that it doesn't feel like, hey, I'm just giving you a suggestion that just would never work.
And how about liability? If somebody creates code for an electric chainsaw and something goes terribly wrong using CoPilot,
That's why we call it CoPilot. At the end of the day, I think the human is still there to ensure, like, somebody's got to test it. Somebody's got to make sure it works. We don't want to, and I always say, like, progressive rollouts, just like we do. Don't just assume it works and then shove it over the wall to all 100, all of your customers all at once. Just progressively roll this out. So I think, it comes back to what we talked about before. There are different parts of the software development lifecycle, and that's why we're making AI differentiated features in each one of those, and they're just all part of GitHub CoPilot. But coding is just 25% of that. All the validation, all the work you do to build and to distribute that actual code that got written by CoPilot is hopefully going to catch that bug of the electric chainsaw before it goes out.
And looking forward 5 or 10 years, what would the daily life of a programmer be like, and how would it be different than today?
Wow, that's a good question.
If
you asked me last year, I wouldn't even. I don't know if I predicted what happened this year, but in 5 to 10 years, I really think the change is going to be about that natural language being that higher order language. How do you interact with the system? And I think we'll have a better understanding of the overall system of your code, of your application, so that as you're asking to make changes, it knows all the places it needs to make those changes. It knows it can kind of predict and test what those changes would happen with, and then allow you to, make those changes in a very safe manner. And I think that kind of interop makes it so that you're able to do more, right? Like there's less time toiling away at all those pieces, and that becomes, again, unleashing more creativity from you as a developer to solve more problems.
And can you share a particularly memorable experience, positive or negative, around Copilot or coding chatbots?
So I think the first time I opened my editor and had Copilot enabled, I was a little skeptical. I was just like everybody else. I was like, is this really going to help me? And I start typing. And again, it's basically predicting what I would have typed, right? It's like, I'm like, yep, you just saved me 100 characters. And I hit tab and I move on. That was like, it's like the magic. Now there's times where it doesn't, it's interesting because there's times when it suggests something. I'm like, that's almost right. But it sparks enough creativity in me to go like, oh, that's what I want to do, but not quite what I want to do. And in fact, I wouldn't do it that way. This is what I would do. And then I'd go off and do it. But it's like there is it's like I have this picture in my brain about how Copilot works. It's like, it's with me everywhere I go, especially as a developer, and it's there to help me. And every once in a while, it'll come and go along and be like, you'll have these moments you're like, oh, that is exactly what it is. Or you'll have these moments like, I'm frustrated. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just flailing away. And I will go over to chat and I will start describing the problem. Like, oh yeah, if I'd have just stopped for a minute and asked the question, that's exactly what I would have done, right? That magical moment of pair programming that I did pair programming when I was, 10 or 15 years ago with actual humans, which I still enjoy, but it's just like the same thing, but it's there all the time with me.
Well, and that brings up another, and in the relationship between you and the chatbot. I mean, is that ever you plus a human pair? I don't mean you necessarily personally, but
Right.
can it be real human pair programmers with Copilot as a kind of third or playing a different kind of role?
Yes. In fact, I have a friend who I develop with every once in a while, when I get my chance to scratch an itch on doing development. And he and I would use Copilot and we would be programming along, and we do this ping pong game where I write a test, you write the code to make it pass, right? Like as a pair programmer thing is like you write, and then basically whenever, at some point you change roles, but there's times when Copilot is suggesting the code and it makes it really easy to implement, or it's, I'm right, I might have to think about like, how would I write this, or, different times where it's there to help in both scenarios. And it's just another thing that's there to help reduce the toil on doing that development. I mean, I always said like the reason that you have a pair programmer is not to like both to make you speed up, type faster. It's there to go like, I have an idea. How about we think about this and how would we solve this problem? No different, but the Copilot is there to do this, to do the same thing. Now you just got another person in the mix or another thing in the mix to help solve those problems. And like he and I use it and it's still pretty magical, but it's still fun to do this. I think it's fun. Some people hate it, but pair program together and do this ideas, because I always find like it's the solving of the problem, which is really the part of the creativity that I like and that I find most developers like. The writing the code is just kind of like the toil. It's like, I can imagine just like if I was writing a book, the words flowing is great, but I wish I could just like get them from my brain onto the paper faster. Same thing. I've got all these ideas about what I want to build and how I want it to go. I wish I could get it from my brain and in there faster. And, if somebody said of Copilot is like, it's programming at the speed of thought. And if I could really do that, that would be amazing.
So what is, well, I mean, do you think it's a stochastic parrot, or is there some real level of understanding there?
I mean, I will not claim to be smart enough to understand all the math. I think in some ways it's both. I mean, are we all not just a bit of a parrot, right? Like, do we really understand how our brains work? Um, I mean, in some ways, I think, yeah. I mean, but I think it's a token generator. It kind of predicts what comes next, and it doesn't know, so it's probabilistic. It's like I don't know exactly what I'm going to say 15 seconds from now, but I'll eventually say it, right? It's this. To me, it's the same thing. I'm not trying to amorphize it. It's just that's what I think about when I think about these tokens and how it happens. Is so a little bit of both.
And um, and so some people are talking about apocalypse, human extinction. Others are talking about a kind of utopia in our future. What do you think of these conversations? And are we worried or hopeful about the right things?
I mean, I think that these different levels of these conversations have happened across human existence. So I think it's just another version of the same thing in my mind. But I'm more hopeful that just like anything, we make as a human race, I believe, and I'm an optimist, forward progress. On if you zoom out in this big timeline, we make progress. It looks very slow during our lifetimes, but I think we do. And I think this is I think this is kind of the next step of making progress. And we will figure out how to use this tool, just like any other tool we invent, to make our lives better. And I think in some ways, yeah, it just like any tool, it could be used for bad things and some things would be worse. But I think overall, I think it's going to, as from a human perspective, it's going to be better. Will it be some utopia? I doubt it. We're really bad at making those. But I don't think it's an existential threat to our existence. I mean, we're existential threats to our existence more than the AI.
So what is your P doom or probability of that AI will doom us all?
I think it's pretty low. I think
Scale of 1 to 100. Sorry.
I mean, like 10. I mean, it's pretty low that it's going to doom us all. The time I think that it dooms us all is when we become so that we stop thinking for ourselves and we let it happens if I at any point of where we stop thinking about how we solve problems or how we're doing, and we just accept whatever, right? We should say the tool is good and it does the things for us, but we shouldn't just be like, that's the end. We should always strive for more and to do something better. And so that we don't just stop. And I think this is where that's where I think progress comes from, is all of us want to move ahead. I mean, again, when I grew up, I was outside riding my bike, so I didn't have a cell phone. My mom yelled at me to come home and things like that. And today we basically are connected everywhere, good, bad, whether you think that's good or bad. But I think that's just the progress that we've made, and any of those progress can be used for good or bad. So I think like doomsday is just like, yeah, I don't think that AI is going to come kill us. Like, I just don't see it happening.